you, and welcome to NCURA's 2022 webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Gerladine Pierre, your facilitator today on this webinar, which is titled Breaking Down Cultural Norms Within an Academic Setting, Strategies for Creating a Safe Space for Honest and Open Dialogue. We have two special panelists today who will be sharing a wealth of information with you. Let me introduce them to you. We have Theresa Caban. She's a director at the Clinical Trials and Industry Contracts Lundquist Institute for Biomedical Innovation at Harbor-UCLA Medical Center. And we have Laneika Musalini. She's a director, Office of Grants Development and Sponsor Programs, Tri-County Technical College. I'm so excited for today's program. Theresa will be discussing with us first about cultural norms, and Laneika will follow with critical conversations. Now I'm going to turn you over to Theresa.
Thanks so much, Geraldine. I'm so excited to get into this. So, cultural norms. What are they? And why do we have to know what they are? Well, it's super important because cultural norms really are the behaviors that exist based on the society and cultures that you live in or work in or are in. That's very generalized. There are four types of norms. There are those folkway norms. Those are the customs. Those are the traditions that come into a community or society and evolve over time. Then there are those mores, those rules that we have to live by, right? Those expectations that the society has put on each other members of the society or all groups in that society to behave in a certain specific and correct or ethical way. And then there's those taboos. Don't you dare go there. Don't do that because that's a no-no. Those taboos, we know what those are in our societies, right? And then, of course, the formal laws, those constructs that are created to help mitigate problems and manage community and society. So that's where the norms sit. There's also a certain level of micronorms, and we'll get into a little bit more of that in a moment. But first, I really want to talk about norms. One, why are they important? Why do we have them? What is the point? And two, what does it mean by changing a norm? And is that even possible? So first, cultural norms are really highly influential over individual behavior in a broad array of contexts and practices within societies they deem whether that behavior has value or not, and they may nurture it if it has value and push it forward and make it more expected, or they may pull back depending on where that community is. Now you're going to see or may have witnessed a bunch of these kind of norms transitioning during this COVID pandemic, right? I'm sure you have, and you're like, now what do we do? Because we don't know what to do. Well, you create new norms. We just behave to adjust to those circumstances. Change. So here we go. Norms and those constructs are information that is traditionally communicated from certain areas or factors. For instance, government, the rules that we live by, education, what we learned as we were growing up, right? From grade school into high school, into college, those influences or norms in our life have changed through time, right? And our perception of those norms has changed, right? As you've gotten older, as you've matured, as you've lived in different circumstances, different cities, different states within the country, maybe out of the country. And as individuals, we collect all of those, right? And they become part of our person, part of our innate behavior, part of our perception. So you can see that the construct of a norm is very embedded in the very essence of who we are as individuals. So to take those apart and kind of look at them under a microscope and really define that behavior can be extremely difficult. So I say that because we have to be kind with ourselves and with our ability to change our behavior for those norms. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about how to do that and some practices and some methodologies that'll help you get there, all of which will prepare you for those conversations. So, for example, you know, the United States is really a melting pot of cultures, right? And everybody is adjusting to everybody's traditions. You know, you can walk down the street in New York City and 50 million smells are going to come up to you because there's 50 different cultures preparing lunch. Let's just say, for example, right? And so that alone is interesting, right? Just the sensory part, right? You take that sensory, all of a sudden, let's say I'm walking down the street, I hear Indian food. Okay, my mouth is going to salivate because I love Indian food. But on one end, on the other end, it's very spicy and olfactory. You're going to smell that Indian food because it's spice-based, right? And so your behavior for the Indian food or your attraction to or from is going to be different than, say, the Subway sandwich stop on the corner, because the smells are different. So your behavior is different. Your reaction is different. So let's broaden that. And when we talk about all norms or more specific behaviors that affect the way we treat each other, which is really the key and the point of this conversation. So that brings us to our first poll question. Do you know what cultural norms were before hearing the definition? And you may or may not have. Norms are behaviors, right? It's our earliest learned ways of being, and those learned ways, whether right or wrong, will always elicit a practiced behavior going forward. And not all cultural norms are beneficial. We learn things that may not be good for us, and behaviors that may be not advantageous. For example, a certain level of acceptance of violent acts. You know, research in the area is really limited right now, but some preliminary studies, as the WHO elicits, show promise in actively influencing or altering existing social norms in order to reduce the occurrence of violence in any given population. So there are opportunities for change. See, oh yes, see, pretty much everybody knew. That's kind of what I expected. I figured most people would know kind of the basic meaning of what a cultural norm is, and that it's behavior-based. That's fantastic. Good. So now that we're all on the same page about what a norm is, how the heck do we think about changing norms? That's a huge question, right? And it requires a lot of considerations. Building a culture of innovation means that we have to change how people think. This is the way we've always done it, or this is what others in the community are doing, so we're just going to do it that way. And the actions that it takes to do those things, this is what we have to do to achieve our goals. Yeah, with a particular emphasis on understanding what people are seeing or being like them. So in other words, we like it very much when other people are like us, whether it's in our look, whether it's in our thinking. We are attracted to those who have similar ideals, similar behaviors, because it makes it easier, because now I don't have to adjust. Oh, yeah. Okay, so what we're really talking about here is adjusting. We have to change our mindset. Our mindset has to be about, how do I meet the other person, right? I know my norms here are this, but can't I challenge that? Can I change the way I think about this norm in spite of everybody else being the same as me? Uh-oh, I'm about to step out of that box. And that's a pretty lonely place. It can be a very, very lonely place. So why change matters? Because COVID happened. That's why change matters. Yes, indeed. Changed everything we know about how we work. At least together, because now we work together alone. That's an interesting concept, right? It still means that now, because we're no longer together, we can't see and sense the behaviors of others because we're zooming in. We're seeing a computer version of that. Somebody doesn't have their camera on, if somebody's microphone isn't on, all of a sudden, technology is taken over. And do those norms even matter? Or is my expectation is everybody's going to follow the rules no matter what? Yeah, right? I don't care where you are, who you are, what you're saying. You're not following the rules. Well, in my opinion, rules are meant to be changed. Right? We are meant to grow as human beings, to overcome the obstacles that were in our way from the time we were Neanderthals to modern man. We have changed our behaviors for the greater good. Why would we stop doing that now? We wouldn't. In fact, now we have to fight harder. Rising technology, work on our communication techniques, because it's key. How we say things is important. Why we say it is important. We have to use the tools we have in our hand to help us make those changes. And really our goal is really to redistribute those norms, change them. Those micro norms that may exist, for example, at work, that's an influencer. That's influenced by government, by media, by home, by your educational background, and by your leadership, right? All of those things make that micro norms of your workplace count. A norms approach attempts to change what people think others like them are doing and feeling, right? And so as a result, changing perceptions of group norms can have an impact on your own behavior. A change of a perception of a group norm will change behavior, certainly in any situation that perhaps may be surrounded by bias, for instance. Dr. Elizabeth Pollack, a professor of psychology and public affairs at Princeton, she is profoundly interested in this concept, and she gives an example of how studying the effectiveness of implicit bias training for reducing bias in organizations, she's found that emphasizing that idea that everyone is biased can normalize and increase bias. That's interesting, isn't it? It's kind of the opposite of what we thought we would need to change. And so when we think about that, we're thinking, okay, all of a sudden, let's reverse that a little bit. Let's say everyone is biased, and the message becomes transformative, right? So this norm is now a transformative norm, messaging that explains to people are committed to overcoming their own biases, and that then can potentially counter the harmful norm. It's a bit complicated, I know. Really, it's about taking those opportunities when they exist, and when, if you've done the personal work, you confront it within yourself. For instance, a reaction to something that's happening in the news. Let's just say, all of a sudden, I'm sitting here as a perceived white woman going, oh, well, I would never. How could we? Oh, I don't know what's going on. Why would somebody do that to anybody? That's not fair. That's not right. Right? I'm indignant. I'm righteous. And then a second later, the Caribbean of who I am comes into view. And all of a sudden, I am who I am. I'm like, hold up. Now I got to stop thinking that way because this is my people. Wait a minute. That's not okay. Why did I go there? I went there because that's where I was trained to go. I went there because that's how I grew up. That's what I knew. I went there because I didn't think for a second that it wasn't okay to go there. That's the basis of the change we have to make. In that second it happens, and you're confronted with that norm in your own mind, you step back for a second and you say, wait a minute, I'm not going to go there because I know that's not okay. Not only am I now my own champion, but I'm now going to elicit a behavior and a change in norm for those around me who see that change, who experience and witness it with me. Now, these are baby steps. These are little tiny micro changes that you're going to be making. Because now, guess what? You learned some, right? You're sitting here listening to this presentation, and hopefully you're coming away with a little bit more information in terms of maybe where you sit on that line of information. Now, I look a certain way that I wasn't born into, okay? When I go and visit my family is 100 different shades of every color and every hairstyle and every faith tradition. And it takes me a minute, honest to God, to sit there and say, wow, we're all the same. We got the same DNA going on here, right? Traditionally, my norm was to say, I'm an introvert. I know, it's hard to believe, but I'm a bit of an introvert. So I step back and I have to re-acknowledge things for myself. I have to think about things in a way that makes sense in a bigger picture for me. Because when I over-personalize things, I have now siloed myself such that I'm not inviting other opinions or ideas or situations. And I pinholed myself into a certain norm of living. And that's not okay. I have to be willing to stretch myself, to stretch my thinking, to change my behavior. Let's just think about social media for a second, right? How this technology is being used. The concept of influencers. To me, this is huge. What an opportunity to sit there and look at other people across the board. I don't know about you, but I sometimes can spend an hour or two, maybe 4, scrolling through TikTok because on a Saturday afternoon I got nothing to do. I'm like, wow, or it's cold outside and who wants to go with TikTok? And I'm looking at all these different people, right? Coming together on one platform, but siloed individuals. They may be all saying different messaging, saying, the freedom of the internet, right? Say whatever you want, however you want it, do it whatever, any which way you want. That too has impact. That too is a norm. See, when we as a society are transitioning, and the use of technology and this idea of being reduced to stay at home to work has really shifted how we interact with each other. I just talked about 2 hours on TikTok, maybe 4. I know I'm not alone. And how is that influencing my own thinking and my own understanding of micro norms and how I'm going to adjust to a situation or scenario, or am I? This really is decision-based. Personally, you have to make the personal decision that it's okay for me to have grown up in this scenario, in this situation. This was the base of who I was. It's not necessarily who I need to be. And so it's very interesting to see how we're going to go across those bases. When you think about these norms reimagined, we're thinking about, from the previous slide we were talking, you saw that tone setting, that understanding, that cognition, innovation. All of this leads to change management, and that's how you create a new norm. These are the basic building blocks of new norm creation. And while you're doing that, you're honoring culture and diversity and equity and inclusion, and you're imagining how much better and broader that norm can be, right? So when you're confronted with a cultural norm that's not accepted anymore, it's not where we want to be. We need to change our process. We need to create nonviolent ways to discuss and debate and to think and behave, ways that are direct but are kind and inclusive. It's about creating a momentum to move forward together, right? And the only thing that I can think of that really blocks our way to that successful kind of reimagination of norms is fear. well, those people aren't like me. Those people aren't like me. I don't know. My fear is getting in my way. I'm allowing my misunderstanding, my unguided truth to lead my way instead of dropping those expectations, opening myself up to what could be and saying, hey, I like your smile. Let's have a chat. You're totally not like me at all. So, example, I'm gay, I am fat, I have a disability, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm an S4 already, and I'm a woman. 5. Okay. So 5 ways that I'm totally different than lots of other people. I bring that experience forward, but that's not what anybody sees. But that's what I know, right? So the only way that I can help others understand me is to communicate it, number 1. Behave in an inclusive manner. 1, don't silo myself away. Don't create teams that only have a certain type of person. Be open. Be willing to step outside of your box. Be willing to be an example for others to follow. Reach deep. And I say these things as if they're easy to do, and I know they're not. They're absolutely probably some of the most difficult things you'll ever do. Changing your own behavior is not easy. I was a smoker for 20 years. You know how hard that is to quit? I changed my behavior. And I'm healthier for it. I'm happier for it. And by the way, as a smoker, people didn't like me a whole lot because that was the antithesis of the norm of my community in Southern California. Let me just tell you. It was a lot of people going by passive aggressively coughing or, doing this. So you get it, right? There's all kinds of ways of being that not everybody's going to like. That's okay. We don't always have to like everything. What we have to do is let it be. Because in the big world of things, the little that we don't like is really just a little, it doesn't matter, right? So some strategies for reimagining these norms, right, is you set the tone. You may have an instance in your work environment where you have a work norm that is incredibly forthright or incredibly divisive, and you just can't do it anymore, but you're waiting on leadership to do something. Guess what? You're a leader too. Why don't you just take that step? Make that small transition. Set your tone. Help change the way people think by changing the way you think. Set those subtle notes. And it could be, instead of inviting those same 5 people to be on your committee, spread your wings. Reach past them. Get new blood, get new people, get new perspectives, get people that you wouldn't imagine have something to say. I guarantee you, they will change your perspective on everything.
Theresa, in organizations, I have a quick question here. You talk about committees. That's a great way to segue into how this will show up in organizations, in your organizations. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, here's the deal. Behavior is probably the hardest thing to change, right? We've set that kind of in stone right now, that we understand that that's the most difficult thing to change. And when you're in an organization and at work that maybe is traditionally run by white men, for example, your opportunities to create moments of change are not going to be available to you necessarily, at least not as often as you would like to. So, like I said, in those instances, let's say in your department or your division where you're creating an opportunity to have a discussion, get as many multiple perspectives as you can. Reach out past the same old folks you normally do. When there's an opportunity for success, invite somebody else instead of the same SME always invite. I guarantee you there may be subject matter experts that we forget about or don't include because that's just the norm, right? Change it up, work it, make it work for you. Use that new thinking to create a group to manage change in your department, perhaps. Why not? Maybe your organization is starting to have and pull together a DE&I group and platform, but why can't you do that on the divisional departmental level? Why can't you do that in your group of friends? What? I know. Let's say you have a group of friends that you created when you were in sorority. Let's just say, for example, why can't you include somebody who wasn't in the sorority in your group of friends now? That's definitely going to change the feel and norm of that group, but you're going to have new conversations and you're going to have interesting perspectives that are outside of what that sorority thinks, does, and believes in, right? That may be good, it may be bad, but you don't know unless you go for it, right? And how bad is anything, really, in terms of the work that we do, right? I don't know. It's all up for grabs, I guess. You know, our organizational norms are really about realizing that change takes time and that it needs to happen, right? We've talked about our microenvironments, our micronorms. Don't be afraid to change behavior. Don't be afraid of anything, really. Our fear is really about ourselves and our own insecurities, and we just get in our way. And we gotta invite people from every level to our conversations. We have to think about what people are actually doing and the behavior that's actually attached to that instead of assuming anything. I think we need to create opportunities for the right people to convey the messaging we need to convey. And, you know, here's the thing. I was just talking about this with my wife. I said, how come every time something ethnic happens in the community, I'm not any ethnicity happens in the community, why is it always a newscaster of that ethnicity reporting that situation? You know what they're doing? They're just pushing that norm back at you. Only this type of person can report this type of news. What? I'm just saying, be cognizant of these things. These are the things that perpetuate our society. These are the things that keep us from changing. These are the things that are roadblocks to the growth we have potential to be in as members of this community. And as research administrators, we can even bring that even down more and say, hey, listen, you know, research administrators are pretty much just women that work together, right? We have such a small percentage of men in this environment. Why? What are we afraid of? Why don't we have as many people who maybe have, I haven't seen quite as many people in wheelchairs or that have accessibility issues or that have some kind of issue that keeps them from being normal like everybody else, right? Why? Why do we hold so tight to those perceived norms of being? It doesn't matter, does it? To let go of those? Does it hurt that much? Yeah, sometimes it hurts quite a bit. We've got to break down those silos. We've got to move forward. We've got to navigate and manage the differences in age, the differences in sexual space, and we need to practice and reflect empathy. We have to care. We have to care. And when you do those things, You know, when you break down a silo that's existed in your division forever, you know what you've done? Once you've broken that down, you've allowed space for new people to come in, for new ideas to expand, for growth to happen. And that's change, right there. That's change. It's that simple. Right now, there's 5 generations in the workplace. 5! Holy cannoli! That's a lot. And we all have to figure out how to manage discussing and talking and learning amongst all these generations who, by the way, were affected by different time frames in history in their development and growth. So their norms are going to be all slightly different, right? And so we have to understand that. We have to be okay with accepting that somebody 20 years my junior is going to say, no, that's not pretty much how we should do that. Huh? How would you know? Well, yeah, they could probably know. Yeah, why not? Why wouldn't they know? It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay, and it's good.
Yeah, thanks, Theresa. This was really a topic that I'm sure we will continue on. But now we're going to move over to Laneika, and we are now going to talk about difficult conversations, Laneika.
Thank you, Geraldine, for the invitation, and thank you, Theresa, for discussing cultural norms. As we think about how to change what has been known as normal, we should realize that conversations need to be had. In America, what's traditionally known as normal are white middle-class values, thoughts, perspectives, and way of life, such as what we consider to be professional, thinking about hair, attire, and speech, or what we consider to be appropriate or acceptable when we think about behaviors, odors, education, how females should look, how males should look, and the list goes on, you know. But we know that the world is quickly evolving. There is no such thing as normal anymore. So how do we move forward with having the conversation when there are disagreements and tensions in the workplace? How do we move forward with trying to understand and accept our colleagues and team members for who they are? How do we bring multi-generation together? And how do we learn of the inequities that some are faced with? It's simple. We have to have critical conversations. Releasing letters of solidarity is not enough. Drafting diversity statements is not enough. And creating DEI committees and task forces is just not enough. We as professionals and colleagues have to come together to have these simple but hard conversations. I hope that you all will partake in this second poll that we have, just trying to gauge where we are. But have you ever engaged in critical conversations? Those are really hard and uncomfortable conversations. Have you had those conversations in the workplace? Wow, 88% have had those conversations. I'm really surprised at this response. But this discussion should be so much easier than I expected because so many of you have already engaged in such conversations. So thank you for participating in that poll. Now we're going to go through some definitions before I get into discussing critical conversations. The first definition is safe space, and a safe space is a place intended to be free of bias, conflict, criticism, or potentially threatening actions, ideas, or conversations where confidentiality is upheld. When we think about a safe space, essentially, you're just ensuring that both parties feel physically safe in their space, the space where the conversation is happening. Then there's unconscious bias, where social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. And we see this a lot. And when we think about unconscious bias, some examples there would be things such as being afraid when you see a Black male wearing a hoodie, thinking about Mexicans coming to America to take our jobs, judging names on resumes as they're listed, or assuming that all human subject participants on a research project has the ability to actually receive and cash a check for their participation payment, participation support. You know, those are things that we automatically think about, but there are biases there, right? We have to get away from that type of thinking. Microaggressions are a comment or action that subtly expresses a prejudiced attitude toward a member of a marginalized group, such as telling a Black person, but you're not like them, or you are so well spoken, or telling a male, I thought that was for females. Um, Even telling someone that they are not qualified to do something when you don't even know what their qualifications are. Then there's racial justice, and you've probably seen this a lot lately, especially with what took place a couple years ago following the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. We've seen racial justice a lot, and this is systematic treatment um, of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. And then there's social justice. That's the fair treatment of all people in a society, including respect for the rights of minorities and equitable distribution of resources among members of a community. And then we have three more definitions before I tie up this in. Equality. We hear that a lot, but equality is when everyone benefits from the same support. Then there's equity, and equity is ensuring that everyone has the support that they need in order to be successful. And then justice, and justice is eliminating the inequities and addressing those inequities and getting rid of the barriers that exist there. We all have freedoms. However, we must acknowledge that not everyone has the same opportunities as others. The civil rights movement fought for equality. At the time, Black people wanted equal treatment and equal opportunities to things that impacted their daily lives, such as being able to walk through the front door of a restaurant and be served as everyone else, having one restroom that was for all races, having access to public colleges and universities, or being able to share office space with their white coworkers. But what we realized over time is that equality is not enough. Just because someone presumes to have equal access doesn't mean that they have the resources or tools necessary to be successful or safe in those spaces. And that's how equity came about. Equity ensures that everyone has what they need to get to where they are going and having the proper resources to be successful on their job. However, it is a fact that inequities continue to persist. Now, we know that even with equality and equity, policies and practices have been put into place that continue to oppress certain people. That's where justice comes in. We have to move towards eliminating those inequities and barriers that continue to persist for all.
We had a very pertinent question, not really a question, but a position that we have to learn, we have to unlearn and relearn. How would you address that in the context of the video?
We absolutely have to unlearn everything that we've been taught from birth because those things that we learned were centered around the cultural norms that Theresa talked about earlier in this segment. So, we know as adults what's right and what's wrong. We have convictions, we have lived experiences to know. We just have to use those things to really change and enact how to do things right, how to change those norms, how to move from being thinking as a majority and think as an individual, but come together collectively as a society of humanity so that we treat everyone the same, that we're respecting and welcoming and including everyone. So we absolutely have to unlearn everything that we have learned and relearn those new things, factual things, things about our history, about our individual cultures as well as the cultures of others, so that we can have that cultural competence to be able to move forward. As mentioned in the video, the very fabric of the US was built upon structural racism. It is evidenced systematically, politically, and practically. Some people may choose to disagree, but the proof is in the pudding. We cannot deny our factual history, but we can prevent history from repeating itself. The only way to begin to make true progress and tear down the systems and policies that have resulted in trauma, racial trauma, cultural trauma, etc., is to have the conversations that lead to change. So today I'm going to be talking about critical conversations. And critical conversations are also known as courageous conversations. You may see it as crucial conversations, but they are crucial collaborative discussions regarding race and culture that challenges historical and contemporary injustices. These conversations lead to a better understanding of the needs of others, such as Black and Brown employees. They enable leaders and employees, both Black and non Black, to become more comfortable having dialogue centered around race. Critical conversations are important to challenge current practices, to foster improvement and growth through conversation, and to provide feedback that will lead to these improvements. In doing this, we have to remain vigilant of equity, because with equity, no one loses, everyone wins. Some specific topics that may come up when you think about critical conversations may include ageism, racism, sexism, disability. When you think about equitable treatment and how the managerial role comes into that, the leadership role, showing favoritism or befriending subordinates, and we know how that can turn out. Fairness in promotion, someone who's continuously overlooked for promotions based on their race, their age, their gender, even unconscious bias and microaggressions that tend to take place in the workplace, such as the language that people are using towards you or others. So we have another poll that I want you all to engage in quickly. Are you comfortable having critical conversations? Now, we had 88% of the people on this call say that they have engaged in critical conversations. How was that experience for you? Were you comfortable having those conversations? It's not easy to do. I can tell you that for sure.
I'm curious. I can't wait to see the results because this is critical in how we move forward to the next discussion.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it is key and very important as to how people deal with critical conversations.
Right.
And yeah, and it depends on also your background. Here we go.
Oh, wow. Look at this. So
Wow.
this is a stark difference from, just having the conversation. Many people are uncomfortable having these critical conversations, and that is completely understandable. We're mixed here, half and half, just about, where most people, well, a split majority, is comfortable having the conversation. I wonder why that is. And then there's the other 51% who are just uncomfortable. So let's talk a little bit more about this. In thinking about critical conversation and all that it involves, we have to provide a way for people to heal, because healing comes through processing. And part of the process is acknowledging the issues or the problems and then working to address those issues and problems. um, when people say Black Lives Matter, they're not discounting the fact that everyone should matter, because history tells us that everyone does not matter. However, they are bringing awareness to the injustices, the racism, and inequities against a people, in this case, Black people. So don't respond by saying that all lives matter. When people say October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month in support of breast cancer survivors and patients, etc., no one says cervical cancer awareness is important too, or prostate cancer awareness is important too. They support breast cancer awareness because that's what we do. By responding in such a manner, um, for example, saying all lives matter, what we're doing is discrediting the fact that Black people and people of color are dealing with real racial issues. We're ignoring that there is a problem. And we're also legitimizing the actions of those who truly do not believe that Black lives matter. Now, don't get confused, because we're not talking about a movement or an organization when we use that phrase. At least I'm not. I'm talking about a phrase that impact the very lives of our colleagues, of our coworkers, of our friends, of our neighbors. Black Lives Matter. Typically, when people want to have a conversation about race, they're faced with rebuttals such as that of, what about Black on Black crime? If Black Lives Matter, what about Black on Black crime? Or, I don't see color. I see everyone the same. Or, you just want to be the victim, or Black people are always bringing things up about race. And then, of course, all lives matter. But that is the wrong response. If we're ever going to move forward as a nation, as a global society, we have to have these conversations. Now, I've led several diversity initiatives for different organizations. A couple that proved to be really impactful were those where we started out by having those critical, courageous conversations that get a clear mind and understanding to a level playing field in that space. And those were the most impactful and most memorable experiences. Now, according to the authors of the book Crucial Conversations, and I mentioned earlier that critical and crucial conversations are interchangeable, but at the heart of the most ambitious transformations lie crucial conversations and those that have high stakes, opposing opinions, and strong emotions. When these three conditions arise, you have entered a crucial conversation. You're going to know there's going to be opposing opinions. People get fully engrossed in their points of view. We know that they do. We see it all the time. There are strong emotions because people feel strongly about their perspectives, about their beliefs, about their way of life. And when stakes are high, opinions vary and emotions run strong. Therefore, you have to expect that these conversations will live up to their names of being crucial or critical or courageous. Let's go to the next poll. We
Yeah,
have
so
one more poll. Yes.
yeah, so while we're waiting for the audience to take the poll, there's some
hmm
questions here that came in the chat about how do we move people to the place where they become uncomfortable when diversity is not present in work environments, particularly when top level roles where critical and impactful decisions are being made.
Wow. So
Yeah.
that's difficult. And what we find is that when engaging in critical conversations or engaging in DEI, it's different for each institution, right? It really just depends on the culture of your institution. And when you have an absence of, diversity, or when you have an absence of inclusion, it's really hard to break through to the people that you need to have the conversations with. Sometimes you have to manage up when it comes to those situations. Sometimes you have to start out, like Theresa mentioned earlier, as a department or a unit to create this movement or to create some type of engagement with these conversations. And hopefully it will lead up to leadership having these conversations. Now, I had conversations with people where they didn't see an issue that they didn't have diversity in their offices, but what they need to understand is that they are missing out on new ideas. They're missing out on innovation and creation and all of these types of things because the various perspectives make us stronger and we're always better together. Now, look at our poll results here. Why do you or people you know avoid having the conversations? And most of all, because people are uncomfortable. And that is a general response. I either get a response from people when I'm having these conversations or when I'm talking about these conversations that is they're either fearful or they're uncomfortable. People would much rather avoid having these conversations altogether, and I get it. But we cannot move forward and make ample progress if we do not engage in these discussions. You may be fearful of having these conversations. You're fearful that you don't know what to say, fearful that you don't know how to start the conversation, or you may say the wrong thing, or you may not know everything that you need to know going into the conversation, but that is okay. We have to start somewhere. So, some expectations before having critical conversations include guaranteeing that a safe space is available for the conversations to occur. A safe space is critically important here. Everyone will feel discomfort at some point during the conversation, but just continue to engage. There may be some non disclosure as you're having the conversation. However, that can be in an effort to protect others or to avoid retaliation because we know that happens as well. But these spaces are not a place for that, right? It's not a place for retaliation. It's not a place to be releasing confidential information that's discussed in that safe space. Allow those engaging in the conversation to speak their truth without retribution or rebuttal, and then work through all of the emotions and continue to engage in the conversation. In order to move forward, you just have to continue to talk, have that dialogue. It's healthy.
So Laneika,
Now, yes,
so civil dialogue, what's the difference? Is it different in critical, crucial conversations? How do we do
absolutely.
that?
Absolutely. Civil dialogue is different from critical conversations because in civil dialogue, you have to actually behave civilly. You have to think civilly. When you're having critical conversations, you're speaking your truth. So you may hurt someone's feelings when you say what you have to say, but it has to be said in order for you to get an understanding and to move forward. So that's the difference between the two. It's okay to have civil dialogue if you don't think you can get to a place of safety, but if you really want to have breakthrough and growth, critical conversations is where you need to be. So here is the process for those conversations, and this is the dialogue that we go by at my institution. On the left side, you'll see what needs to happen with you. So for you, you want to both see and hear. So you're looking at the person, you're hearing what they're saying, you're listening as they're talking. Then when it's your turn, you tell a story. It could be a personal story, it could be something that has impacted you, stories actually trigger emotions. And so you'll see a lot of that playing out as you have these conversations. Get comfortable being uncomfortable. I can't say that enough. When you get to feel, you see this red circle going around. So you know you are really entering this crucial moment because the emotions are running high. How are you feeling? How are you going to respond? Are you going to get offended? Are you going to become defensive? Are you going to shut down and become silent or withdrawn? Or are you going to become violent? And when I say violent, hopefully not physically, but verbally violent by attacking or labeling or trying to control the narrative of the conversation. You want to avoid this red circle if you can. However, you have to realize that when you're having these conversations and people start to feel uncomfortable and their emotions start to run high, you're going to experience some of this. But the key is to push through. You have to be mindful. You know that, this is really uncomfortable, not just for you, but for the other people that are in the conversation as well. Just push through. Continue to reach shared meaning, learning, and agreement of action. Expect the same thing from those other people, as I mentioned in the conversation. If there's silence, it is likely that at least one of the parties have withdrawn. That's okay. On the contrary, if emotions are not managed, it can lead to violence, as I mentioned earlier, and you can see here in the diagram. Just take a moment, repeat what has been said, affirm the emotions, and then move forward. That's what we do. We behave as adults. So a safe space is pertinent for the conversation to be successful. Now, although critical conversations are generally about race or culture, there are other critical and courageous conversations that need to be had, such as that of gender, equal pay, and women's rights, as well as that of people with disabilities or those who have a need for some type of accommodations. And, the list can go on and on about conversations that need to be had because many people would prefer to just ignore that there's an issue altogether. But there's no way that we can grow, that we can learn, that we can move forward if we're ignoring those issues. We have to have conversations surrounding all of the issues. Before people will come forward and be honest with you, you have to create a safe space for them to have these conversations. So trust is key. People are not going to be open and honest with you if they cannot trust you or the people in the space. Your actions will always speak louder than your words. Then you want to establish mutual respect and confidentiality before the conversation begins. Get the ground rules laid out before you even open your mouth to go into the conversation. Everyone in the space should feel comfortable. Therefore, the conversation may need to take place outside of a traditional office setting, and that is okay. If virtual, because we know there's a lot of remote work taking place, the conversation should not be recorded, and all parties should be in a place without others around. So it needs to be private. And there again has to be that trust there in order for this to be successful. If it's a physical environment, choose your space carefully. The space should be culturally appropriate and in neutral territory where all persons feel physically safe. And make the space as welcoming and inviting as you can, or try using alternative seating if possible. Vulnerability can be a good thing as well. Be vulnerable and allow yourself to build an emotional connection. Make room for who you are without having your guard up. Take the guard down. Be honest, be open, speak your truth. Make the conversation inclusive for all to share. Don't focus on if there's just a minority in the group, focusing on that one person. You want to give everybody space to talk. Everyone needs to be engaged in the conversation, not just focusing on one person um, at that time. And then you want to ensure that the conversation is free of any bias, stereotypes, or judgment. Anyone in the space or conversation should call out that behavior as soon as it starts. Do not allow for those things to enter into the space. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. So keep an open mind and be willing to give as well as to receive. Because critical conversations, it's an opportunity for everyone to learn. So some strategies here. Before facilitating or engaging in critical conversation, one must have a moderate to high level of emotional intelligence. So if you're easily offended, the conversation space may not be a good place for you. Some strategies that you can use. First, you want to keep an open mind, as I mentioned already. Listen to understand and not to respond. That means active listening. You're really taking in what the person is saying, not necessarily to respond to what they're saying, because that's not what this conversation is about, but to understand. And then when it's your turn, you're going to do the same thing. Be self-aware. Do not become defensive. Do not attack. Do not use microaggressions or deflect. These mechanisms make matters worse. Do not do that. Be respectful, even if you get offended. And then avoid resistance and have a goal for the outcome in mind. You know, you're not exactly sure how the conversation is going to go, but you do know that you want to understand. So have a plan for how you respond in the event that the conversation goes awry, and how do you get back to that place of understanding? The overarching goal of critical conversations are learning, finding the truth, producing results, and strengthening relationships. So, overall, critical conversations are meant to be uncomfortable, but they're necessary for us to learn and grow, and we have to start somewhere. There are no losers when having these conversations. Everyone is positioned to win. Know that it'll take more than one conversation, and it must be consistent and ongoing with action for progress to be made. People may hear your words, but they feel your attitude, and that is a quote from John Maxwell. Now, open dialogue, we're moving right along in this critical conversation process. There are two types of dialogue that you can have, one-on-one or group. So for one-on-one, it's more of a private discussion. This can occur by request or by mutual agreement between the two individuals. When thinking about having a conversation, ensure that your motives are pure. This conversation should not be about proving someone wrong, but you need to establish that mutual respect in the beginning, lay out what your intentions are and what they are not. And during the conversations, emotions are bound to arise, and that is okay. That's what happens when you're having these conversations. Acknowledge those feelings and continue the conversation in a healthy manner. And it is important that we check our privilege when we have these conversations. We all have some type of privilege, some more than others. However, given the situation, privilege cannot come into play if there is to be complete understanding. Actively listen. If something is misunderstood, ask for clarification. And here you're listening again to understand and not to respond. And 4 tips here are to act. And when you act, it's to get things rolling. And then mirror. Mirroring is to confirm your feeling. You want to paraphrase to acknowledge their story and then prime when you feel like you're getting nowhere. So you want to take a little time to really think about what has been said and how to move forward. You want to continue to ask questions so that you get past that stuck place where you are if that happens. And then try not to become derailed during the conversation. Ensure that the conversations remain centered around whatever issue you're discussing, whether it's race, gender, wage, equity, whatever it is, keep the conversation centered. And be open to transparency, as transparency leads to accountability. The hope is when people know better, that they do better. Now, for group dialogue, the same rules for one-on-one dialogue should be followed with a few additions. If it's a planned dialogue session, ensure that you have invited a diverse and inclusive group of individuals to participate. Be open to a wide range of perspectives and remember to keep an open mind. There will be emotions and maybe tensions, but as a facilitator, please acknowledge those feelings. It is okay if people are having these feelings. Throughout the discussion, use understandable, accessible, and inclusive language and concepts. Be inclusive. Don't single anyone out. Listen. Make sure that the space is welcoming and non-threatening to anyone participating. Give other people space to talk. It's not about one person. It's not about you. It's about everyone learning and engaging and moving forward and growing and understanding. And although a safe space serves as a vehicle for you to unleash all of your thoughts, do not dominate the conversation. Have space for everyone to speak. And after any type of critical conversation, after any type of courageous or crucial conversation has occurred, take time for self reflection before the next conversation occurs. In some instances, it may be necessary to do some reflection before the conversation actually commences. And so here's just a diagram of what happens before, during, and after these crucial conversations. So before the conversation, you want to prepare yourself. That's basically what you're doing there. You're getting your thoughts together. You're really thinking about what you want to bring up in the discussion, making sure that you're in a safe space, making sure that you can trust the person that you're going into the conversation with. During the conversation, you want to follow the process, see, hear, tell a story, feel, and act as we saw above to get a shared meaning. And then after the conversation, come up with an action list and schedule the next conversation. Now we're going to have a video here to talk about critical conversation mistakes, and pay close attention. All right, thank you all for watching that video. Just to reiterate the top 5 mistakes, going into defensive or combat mode, and I've already warned you about the emotions are going to run high, but be sure to not get offended and go into defense mode or combat mode and start attacking the person. And then you really don't want to oversimplify the problem, because what may seem simple to you may be a really difficult issue for the person that you're engaging in the conversation with. Not having enough respect, and this here, I mean, you really should be respectful to everyone on the job. But if you're in a situation where you know a conversation needs to be had and that respect is not there, it's up to you to start working on creating space for there to be mutual respect and for that trust to start growing. Because again, if a person doesn't trust you or respect you, the conversation is not going to happen. And if it does happen, the person's not going to be completely honest with you. But letting your emotions get involved, you have to be careful here. If you feel that you're becoming emotional, if you know that you're withdrawing, if you know that you feel like you want to attack, take a moment to step back. And then being over rehearsed. And although you need to be prepared for the conversation, let it occur naturally. Don't be over rehearsed. You have in your mind what you want the outcome to be. Just stick to that and allow the conversation to go wherever it's going to go. Now, we have another short video right quick. This will be your last video for today. But On this video, it's talking about intent versus outcome, and Dr. Cheryl Ingram is the founder and CEO of Inclusology and the Diversity LLC, which is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm specializing in DEI assessments, training, coaching, and consulting. And in this video, she gives brief explanation of intent versus outcome. Pay close attention. Awesome. Thank you. Now, I think that's a great example of what Dr. CI gave just now in that video, but please understand that your intent does not equal impact. Think about how you say things, why you say things, and your approach. Unconscious and implicit bias may really come into play here. What you think you said may not be what was heard. The fact is, if someone feels unsafe, set up, or offended, they are not going to have open conversations with you. Just a quick example, there was a situation where someone sent an email. The person was very cordial at first. By the end of the message, the person had gone for the jugular. And when I responded with facts, I was practically called an angry Black woman. Imagine that. That is crazy. How is it that someone can offend someone and treat someone that way and then miraculously become the victim? It doesn't work that way. In these situations, a conversation needs to happen. However, likely there may need to be a neutral mediator present. Again, if there is no trust, the conversation will not be productive. So you may be thinking, what happens next? If you recall the last webinar of 2021, it was about allyship. And in thinking about allyship, we've come up with these 5 things here about what happens after the conversation. You want to start out again by reflecting. Think about, what was discussed in the prior meeting. Think about, your thoughts and how you feel about things. Get your emotions in check. Take a deep breath, center yourself, and, go right into it. Continue the conversation, and eventually you may want to invite others or host additional conversations with different groups. That's great. Act on feedback received at the end of each conversation. People are going to be watching to see if you actually do what they have, what you all talked about in the conversation. So act on that feedback, and then ask for feedback on how things are going since having the conversation. Measure change and engage in continuous learning and improvement. Lastly, you want to practice becoming a better version of you by becoming an ally or an advocate. Thank you all for your participation and listening. We're now going to open it up for questions and answers.
And while we're waiting for our participants to feed us with some questions, look at your screen. There are resources there, huge resources that we can take back from Theresa's and Laneika's presentation today. We can take that back into our workplace and practically use it. As we wait for questions here, Laneika and Theresa, how do we merge the discussion of norms and critical conversations? How do we merge those two as we conclude this session today?
Wow. Theresa, I've been doing a lot of talking. Would you like to go first?
Sure. I think the key is really what Laneika has set out here in front of us is to have the courage to have the conversation. I think ultimately what we learn and know and how we behave is governed by the information that's shared and the opportunities that exist, and when they exist, to not be afraid to engage, but to be willing to put yourself out there, to be the test subject for the conversation, to be strong enough in knowing who you are, to be willing to be open and stretched by somebody else.
Right. I think openness here is really important because, we all get comfortable in doing things the way that we like to do things or the way that we were taught to do things. But we have to remember that there's always opportunity for growth And that growth comes from learning from other people, or, just gleaning from something else that someone else has done or that has proven to be successful. We're always talking about best practices, especially in research administration, and we share those ideas and things. The same thing occurs with this situation when talking about cultural norms and changing those norms and having these critical conversations. It's the same type thing.
So other discussions here about norms, I have a funny one that usually comes to mind in these critical post-COVID times. I always get conversation about the pre-COVID situation where we had maybe about, I would say, I don't know if the percentages are correct, but I think about 20 to 25% of the population were remote workers, versus now where the percentages, as we know, has escalated. So there used to be this privilege pre-COVID versus post-COVID, Theresa, with these norms that occurred before versus now, and that privilege with that change. So how can we address a pre-COVID remote worker versus the norm now, where most people, the percentages have gone up for remote workers is the norm now?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's there's a lot there. So let's start with the remote versus old remote or grandfathered remote and new remote, and what does that look like? There are new norms now in terms of remote work. Why? Because a majority now of people have gone to that, right? And so that might be an adjustment for those who are grandfathered into that process, right? Where they're like, oh, or the people who have done it before for a longer period of time, that 20% or 25% would be like, well, no, that's not how we do things, right? Or from a remote perspective. But given that such a large percentage of people have transitioned, I would think and I would hope that those norms would be changing to accommodate this new work from home process, right? This new remote way of being. And that, in my mind, requires a whole heck of a lot more communication, a whole heck of a lot more honesty, a lot more integrity. Why? Because we can't see each other all the time. And when you can't see folks, as human beings, the first thing we're going to do is question, what are they really doing? Right? And so it has to be, you got to get past that. Right? Immediately, our first thought should be, they're working. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. My mom used to have this old adage, no news is good news. Right? I don't know how true that is now, but in a lot of ways, I kind of hold that close to my heart and say, yeah, maybe it's okay. And when they want to have that conversation, got to be open to it. Got to be open to it.
Yeah. Right. And just to add here to what Theresa was saying, I think it's also important too, as leaders and managers, to pay attention to the inequities that arose from, people being forced to work remotely compared to those who really wanted to work remotely. And so just ensuring that those inequities are being paid attention to, and that we're supplying our employees with the resources and tools that they need to be successful on their job.
That's a great point, Laneika. I mean, there's plenty of organizations and staff. I have staff, or I had staff that weren't necessarily able to afford their own internet connection.
Right.
So there's lots of things we have to consider that we may not have had to consider before. And that's a perfect point to make. Exactly.
Yes, as I think about that, back to that slide where Laneika, we showed the equity, the inequity. Yes,
equality and justice. Yeah,
that's the perfect example of in the work what post-COVID has brought us to really, some of the realities of some of our co-workers, their environment. There's a question here about that we have a few minutes that maybe we can discuss about civil conversations, and how do you continue the conversation where each person is not pressing the other button to the point of incivility. What would you suggest?
Call HR. I would suggest that they call HR. Don't take matters into your own hand because it's not going to turn out well. And there could even be some legal liabilities there. So you have to be really careful. Again, that mutual respect and having those ground rules is going to be important. But remember, I said being in a safe space where people feel physically and mentally safe, as well as having that trust there is going to be key to these conversations being successful.
And then I'll flip it on the first side of the beginning of it is how to engage in that first series, having that courage to engage and taking that first step to engage in this hard and critical conversation. You know, maybe taking sipping a glass of wine and getting relaxed. Maybe. Well, what are some of the suggestions you could you give to us as to how to take that first step to start that very critical conversation and sometimes difficult conversation in the workplace?
Sure. I'll be real brief because I know that we're running out of time. But when thinking about the first conversation, I think it's critical that you plan, first of all, and also if you're wanting to do a group type dialogue, open dialogue, have conversations with other people who may have already engaged in some type of critical conversation, but also have conversations about the expectations of those who you are inviting into that space. Again, having that mutual ground there is going to be really important. And if people come into a space expecting one thing and receive something else, then they may check out mentally before the conversation even begins. So I think, just thoroughly planning and looking at the resources that we provided in the slides will be very helpful because there is a brochure or a pamphlet there that actually lays out step by step what you should do to plan to have these conversations. So again, thank you all for having me today. It's really fun.
It was.
Thank you too.